This video is the first in what I hope will become a series of informational clips about 19th century periodicals and newspapers from the UK. I will provide an overview of publications that are of interest. Some will be famous, some will be important, and some will be obscure but reflect a larger movement. I will also look at key figures who were involved in the publications and their importance to wider literary, cultural, social, and historical discussions. Finally, I will sometimes forego exploring a single publication to look at a network of interesting publications which competed or collaborated and which made a significant impact to UK history. I hope that people can use these overviews to gain background information about these publications, and that seeing these ideas through a video will help researchers and enthusiasts alike. I must stress that I'm providing an overview. I will try to be as comprehensive as possible, but this approach requires that I take some liberties when presenting information. I will have to glance over certain subjects, particularly those which are tangential to my main idea. At the end of each video and in the comments, I will indicate some of the other primary sources that I used for your reference and further reading. So without further ado, I have decided that The Nation will be the first publication that I cover. The Nation was a hugely influential publication that in many ways epitomized Irish nationalism in the mid-19th century. But why begin with The Nation? I have two major reasons for this. First, it's a major publication that had a long-standing influence on Ireland and abroad. Second, it's not English. Although I will cover English periodicals and newspapers extensively, I want to commit to texts from elsewhere in the UK because their histories are often just as engaging as the histories of major English publications, but they don't receive the same fanfare. For me, The Nation provides a happy medium between all of these tensions. It's distinctly Irish, but concerns itself with Anglo-Irish relations, Irish independence, and Irish nationalism. Its impact was felt in England and abroad, and it influenced movements long after its decline and eventual demise. The Nation was founded on October 15, 1842. It was a Dublin publication that circulated widely and had a vast impact, especially in the 1840s, when it was the organ of the Young Ireland nationalist movement. Young Ireland was a political nationalist group that founded The Nation and benefited greatly from its publication and contents. The Nation helped to promote cultural nationalism, which ultimately buttressed Young Ireland's political motives by getting people involved in nationalism. The cultural nationalism of The Nation and the political nationalism of Young Ireland were largely codependent. Political nationalism gave writers a platform to write about Irish issues through their articles, poetry, and fiction. These writings, which are evidence of cultural nationalism, fueled the political debates and movements that inspired Irish people from all social classes. Matthew Kelly provides one of the best definitions of The Nation that I have encountered. He says that it functioned as the in-house journal for the established nationalist elite, acting as the forum for a party that did not quite exist. Focusing the energies of leading activists, it sometimes initiated and always promoted their many false starts and short-term initiatives. Under its founders, Charles Gavan Duffy, Thomas Davis, and John Blake Dillon, The Nation achieved tremendous success in the mid to late 1840s. All three were prominent nationalists who helped to shape Ireland's fight for independence. All did remarkable things, albeit on very different paths. Charles Gavan Duffy was a young nationalist and budding lawyer when he began The Nation in 1842. Duffy was primarily concerned with the Irish land question, which considered Irish tenants and peasants' rights to own and distribute land rather than having British and Scottish landlords controlling the Irish peasantry. This cause culminated in the formation of the Tenant Right League in August 1850. The organization sought to instill laws and reforms in how Irish land was distributed and to protect tenant rights. In his time as an editor, proprietor, and contributor for The Nation, Duffy was arrested for sedition numerous times, serving a 9-month prison sentence in 1844-1845, and again facing trial in 1848, which I will discuss later in this video. He championed his cause through The Nation until at least 1853, and he emigrated to Australia in 1856. He would go on to become a member of the Australian Parliament as a Premier of Victoria, but never returned to Ireland. John Blake Dillon's involvement with The Nation is directly related to his founding of Young Ireland. Although I must stress that all three were involved, Dylan was particularly invested in the movement. Of all three nation founders, Dylan was most closely associated with Young Ireland. It is no surprise, then, that when Young Ireland rebelled in 1848 in a protest against the famine, Dylan was one of the leaders of the movement. The failed uprising led to Dylan's arrest, and he was sentenced to death. The sentence was later altered, but Dylan emigrated to the United States, leaving the nation behind. After spending time working as a lawyer in New York, Dylan returned to Ireland in 1855 and spent the rest of his life here. By 1855, however, the political landscape in Ireland had shifted. Charles Gavin Duffy was leaving Ireland, the nation had taken a different path, and Dylan was in Ireland on amnesty. He would not return to the publication which he helped to initiate. Rather, he was involved in politics, being elected to Irish Parliament in 1862. Thomas Davis's life is the shortest of the three founders. He, like John Blake Dylan, was a primary figure in the Young Ireland movement. He was also central to the rift that gave Young Ireland, and by extension the nation, its prominence. He, like Dylan, was a part of Daniel O'Connell's nationalist movement, which successfully advocated for Catholic emancipation in the 1830s. This Old Ireland movement defined nationalism before the nation and Young Ireland were formed. Young Ireland derived from a rift between Davis and O'Connell on who should have access to university instruction. O'Connell wanted to give access only to Irish Catholic people, while Davis wanted this education for all Irish people, regardless of faith. O'Connell called Davis and his followers Young Ireland as a derogatory term indicating their inexperience, but the term stuck, and the younger nationalists parlayed this name into one of the most prominent nationalist organizations in Irish history. Davis was a more moderate nationalist than his companions and counterparts, and he helped to bring some balance to the nation's discussions. He wrote tremendous ballads and poetry for the nation, and he was also central to creating the nation's name. His influence on the nation and on nationalist politics, however, was short-lived. Davis succumbed to scarlet fever in 1845 when he was only 30 years old. All three founders followed diverging paths, but for a brief time in the 1840s they developed a profound influence over Irish nationalism and reshaped nationalist discussions. They created one of the most enduring publications of the 19th century, and they set the bar for all future nationalists. Through the nation, they gave new life to Irish nationalist debates, and they gave their sympathizers an unprecedented platform to learn about, promote, and reinforce their patriotism. Despite being an expensive publication, the nation achieved a tremendous circulation. It circulated widely, regularly selling over 10,000 copies weekly. At its height, it sold 13,000 copies per week. Evidently, its high cost of 6 pence did not deter its readers. Hugh Oram explains that it was so popular that most readers would have to borrow it from news vendors for a penny an hour. Because many readers could not afford 6 pence from their weekly salaries, news vendors adapted to accommodate their needs. This unique means of circulation whereby vendors would rent the publication allowed the nation to reach more readers across numerous social classes. Because this rental method did not provide accurate data of all those who read the paper, it is likely that the nation reached an even larger weekly audience than is estimated. Although there were over 10,000 copies sold weekly, which in itself is a large circulation, the number of people who read the publication was far higher. Achieving such a large circulation enabled the nation to enhance nationalist discourse among all levels of Irish society. It made nationalist ideas widespread and accessible to all audiences. This was important for numerous reasons. First, it gave Irish nationalists a large platform upon which they could promote their ideas. Second, it encouraged more scrutiny of Irish affairs, Irish independence, and England's suitability to rule. Related to this, it opened up new discussions about Ireland and Irishness. Lastly, it promoted Irish culture across all levels of Irish society, giving people literature, articles, and verse by some of the biggest writers of the age. Because of the nation, many of the greatest Irish writers were given a voice. Through the nation, Ireland was able to hear some of its most prominent voices, such as William Carleton, James Clarence Mangan, Douglas Hyde, James Fintan Lawler, Thomas D'Arcy McGee, Charles Kickham, John Kells Ingram, and Richard Robert Madden. Each of these figures could take up a video to themselves, and they represent a fraction of the great writers who contributed to the nation. Alas, I can only cover a few, and even at that, I will have to keep it brief. James Clarence Mangan was a prominent Irish writer. He was among the most famous of the nation's contributors, but ironically, he was not as celebrated by the paper as you might think. I will discuss this more in depth a bit later in the video, so stay tuned. Charles Kickham was an excellent contributor from a young age. He began contributing to the Nation at age 22, and he was a devout nationalist and revolutionary throughout his life. Over time, he became more revolutionary and nationalist, becoming a primary contributor to Fenian publications like Irish People. Richard Robert Madden was a doctor, an abolitionist, and a great writer. His work about Irish periodical literature is still a key starting text for scholars of Irish bibliographical literature. William Carleton is one of the most celebrated Irish authors from this period. He contributed to the Nation, but his politics were less nationalist than many others who contributed to the periodical. Nevertheless, Carleton published widely to great acclaim. Douglas Hyde's publication of the Love Songs of Connaught were published in the Nation in 1890 for the first time. This popular volume indicates the enduring prominence of the Nation into the later century, albeit in its diminished form. Notably, several women were regular contributors to the Nation. Most wrote under pseudonyms and have drawn the interest of several contemporary critics. The most prominent women who wrote for the Nation include Ellen Mary Patrick Downing, who wrote under the name of Mary, Mary Ann Kelly, whose pseudonym was Ava, Jane Francesca Wilde, who was called Speranza, Mrs. Beasley, also known as Nanny H.H., and Olivia Knight, whose pen name was Thomasine. Lady Jane Francesca Wilde is particularly notable. She was part of a group who continued the new series of the Nation in the 1850s, and she was a prominent Irish writer whose interests were in Irish folklore. She eventually moved to London, yet continued to write about Irish topics. For those of you wondering, yes, she was indeed Oscar Wilde's mother. Such a distinction should not, however, overtake her own prominence as an Irish writer. Mary Ann Kelly published her first poem in the Nation at age 15. She would continue a prominent career as a writer for the Nation, even marrying a young Irelander named Kevin O'Doherty. Even after he was transported for sedition, she continued to write for the Nation. She became so famous that once, when she traveled to the United States, the San Francisco Monitor referred to as Eva of the Nation, and this title was used in Australia by a group raising funds for her after her death. In the 1840s, James Duffy helped to create a compendium of the nation's most prominent poetry. Working with Charles Gavan Duffy, who was not a relation, Duffy issued a volume called The Spirit of the Nation. Numerous volumes of The Spirit of the Nation were published throughout the 19th century, with each subsequent volume being tweaked to feature new poetry from the nation's contributors. The Spirit of the Nation, therefore, was an ever-evolving publication which kept its finger on the pulse of Irish poetry's evolution. It changed as some writers grew in prominence and others fell out of favor. James Clarence Mangan, who I discussed before, is one particular example of this constantly changing publication. A popular writer when the Nation first began, Mangan's contributions featured less and less as subsequent volumes of The Spirit of the Nation were published. This decline was not seen as a positive by many, however. Jacques Chiteau writes that Mangan was so overlooked that C.P. Meehan, Mangan's friend, added a comprehensive index of Mangan's works at the end of one edition of The Spirit of the Nation. Most people agree that the Nation passed its zenith in the 1840s. Numerous factors were involved in this decline. The first major factor was Thomas Davis's death from scarlet fever in 1845. Davis, the more moderate nationalist of the group, was integral to balancing its message. After his death, the paper became more aggressive and lost a key dimension of its message. In the same year, 1845, Charles Gavan Duffy's wife, Emily McLaughlin, died. There is debate about how impactful this loss was. Duffy remarried in 1846 to Susan Hughes and formed a family with her. So while it is certain that Duffy's grief at losing two of the closest people in his life impacted the publication, the effects were part of a larger whole. Around the same time, John Mitchell was hired to replace Thomas Davis as editor of the journal. Mitchell, a more extreme nationalist, brought these politics to the Nation, replacing Davis's more moderate voice with a more severe dialogue. Mitchell would eventually leave the paper to found his own nationalist organ, the United Irishmen. Nevertheless, the changes under Mitchell's editorship narrowed the Nation's scope and rendered it a more extreme paper. Such changes undoubtedly alienated some of the paper's audience, especially the more moderate nationalists. These changes were part of a larger decline, and they marked a distinct shift in tone. It can be said that the nation lost a part of its voice when Davis died and never recovered, but let's not get too sentimental. There was a distinct shift in tone that contributed to the nation's decline, but it was not fatal. Compound all of this with John Blake Dillon's arrest, sentencing, and emigration, and most of the founding members of the nation were no longer part of its cause. One of the final trials which the nation faced in its first series and in its most prominent years was when Charles Gavan Duffy was arrested for sedition in 1848 for writing a manifesto suggesting that Ireland should be independent from England but share the same crown. This was not the first time that this happened or that Duffy had spent time in prison. Remember that he served 9 months in 1844-45. But this arrest was yet another strike against the nation's management as it was known. Things were different when the paper was restarted after Duffy's release in 1849 without a conviction. The legal costs of his trial were severe and Duffy was never able to regain the nation's previous circulations. The lessened status of the nation made it ripe for attacks from dissenters like John Mitchell and his violently nationalist United Irishmen. By the mid-1850s, the nation no longer had the same influence over the Irish people. However, this decline is often overstated. The hyperbole with which some critics consider this diminished status is unfounded. Sure, the nation was no longer the tour de force that it had once been, but it continued into the 1890s and published regularly. Too often people overlook the period between 1850 and 1890, but the reality is that some great writers including Eva, Speranza, Douglas Hyde, and George Sigerson, to name but a few, contributed to the paper during this 40-year period. The spirit of the nation continued to be issued, constantly evolving and giving a platform for new nationalist voices. The nation remained a strong nationalist voice that inspired generations and impacted future movements. One can even argue that the seeds of the nationalist movements of the early 20th century had been planted in the nation in the 19th century. Its name changed to the Weekly Nation in 1897 and officially folded in 1890. It left a legacy like none other in Ireland. It is still a primary reference point for researchers today, and it inspired generations of young Irish nationalists, contributing largely to the movements that ultimately gave Ireland its independence. Even near the end before its absorption into the Irish Weekly Independent, the nation was bigger than just a paper. It represented a way of thinking, an attitude and an identity that believed in Irish independence and Irish culture. It promoted this culture through the writing of some of the 19th century's greatest Irish authors, and it inspired generations to think about their Irish identity and their place as individual, distinct people. Alas, I touched only the surface of the nation and its impacts on Irish society in this video. If you want to learn more about this topic, I encourage you to look at the following resources. The Waterloo Directory is a primary resource for everything I do. It is a one-stop shop for information, and it contains a listing of people who were involved in the publication, the frequency with which it was published, comments about the periodical, and a comprehensive listing of all the sources that discuss the periodical. If you want to learn more, I would start here. The Dictionary of Irish Biography is a great resource to consult for information about key people like Mangan, Eva, Lady Wilde, Duffy, Davis, and Dillon, for example. Barbara Hayley and Enda McKay's volume called The Voice of 19th Century Ireland is an excellent resource for Irish periodicals. Hugh Oram's newspaper book is terrific for all periodicals beyond simply The Nation. Finally, Matthew Kelly's article on Irish national opinion discusses the political tendencies of the nation, particularly about violence. There's a rich body of work on the nation, and a researcher could literally spend months studying it. I hope that you have the pleasure of tapping into this information. Cheers!